Good evening, Jaycee.
Good evening, Father.
Good evening, Father. Good to see you.
You too.
Thanks for agreeing to do this tonight.
Excellent. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad to be here.
It's a fantastic experience and a good opportunity.
I'm glad to have you here. So we're obviously going live on YouTube this evening. So thanks for those of you who have tuned in live for the first of this podcast, but also those of you who might be listening later in the week. I'm Father Nicholas Pearce. I'm the Assistant Vocations Director here in the Archdiocese of Melbourne.
And I'm Jaycee Napoles. I'm a sixth-year seminarian, currently studying for the Archdiocese of Melbourne. And I've been in Corpus Christi College for my formation.
But at the moment, you're living here at Holy Family Mount Waverley.
Oh, yes. So for those who are listening in the future, it's COVID-19 season. Well, it wasn't a welcome season, but it's the season of COVID-19 and social distancing and isolation. And Father Nick invited me here in Holy Family Parish, and
We've been here 2 weeks and we've already worked our way through Netflix and Stan and everything else.
Yes,
so we decided we had to find something else to do with our Wednesday nights.
Indeed.
And we thought what better to do than to have a stand-up conversation about discernment and the particular vocations to the diocesan priesthood. So just a call out on the name to start with. So especially if you're listening on the podcast, you won't be able to see, but we're standing up. We've decided that this is an important topic, so important that we can't actually sit down and have the conversation.
Yes, I was actually a bit confused of the whole concept. Can you walk us through how it is you came about discernment standing up?
There's a bad echo. It's a great start, JC. There we go. Now the bad echo is off.
Thank you.
If you didn't hear any of that, we probably should start again. It's first podcast teething problems, but I'm sure I know what the problem was. So we're here. It's called Discernment Straight Talk. Straight up. So we're standing up, but we thought it was time to actually have a pretty straight and forthright conversation about discernment. It's important, and sometimes we skirt around the topic. Sometimes we're a little bit afraid to sort of speak clearly. So we thought with the benefit of the anonymity of a podcast, we might have the chance to have a conversation straight up about it. But also, I think there's something about standing up, because sometimes we think that discernment is a passive activity. Do you know what? I'm just discerning, if you know what I mean? And 3 years later, we're still just discerning. Where, at least from my understanding and from the scriptures, that the discernment of the Spirit is an active movement, and it's something that takes a bit of action on the part of the individual, but also on the part of the church. So we're standing up. We're standing up
and ready to move.
And ready to stand up and be counted. And I think one thing that we've seen in COVID-19, in particular in the absence of the sacraments, is a real longing in the people. It's been my experience in particular, JC, about how edifying it has been, how much the faithful have longed for the sacraments. But I think it's a timely reminder that without enough priests into the future, there's going to be a greater longing for the sacraments.
Indeed.
And even in our church here in Australia and in different parts in the world already, because of a lack of number of priests, there's faithful who go without the sacraments for extended period of time. So it's time to... That's where the name came from. And what we're going to be doing while we're on the podcast is we're going to be working through this great book by Father Brett Brannon from the USA called To Save 1,000 Souls. And if you're from the Archdiocese of Melbourne, there's thousands of copies of these available. They're sort of sitting on bookshelves and
in your garage,
youth groups, and in my garage. It's also available via Amazon for Kindle or for purchase. The Kindle version is only about $8. Just make sure, if you are going to get it, that you try and get the international version, because there is an American version and there is some slight differences. So the international version is the best. But you don't need it to listen to the podcast.
Indeed.
But we're going to make our way through it over the next couple of weeks.
Yep. Yes, we are. And we're going to go through some guided questions right from...
Yeah, so they put together a sort of a study program to have a look through the book called the Melchizedek Project, so you can have a bit of a Google for that as well. So we're going to stick to that a little bit.
Excellent.
As an outline, but we're not necessarily going to stick to it too closely.
Okay,
because conversation with you, JC, can sometimes go off in...
But I do like to stick with the outline, but...
we'll see
how we go.
The other thing, and I suppose it's important to say that there might be some young ladies who have tuned in this evening or who are listening to the podcast. It is a podcast specifically about discernment for the diocesan priesthood. But there will be lessons and things in it that you can apply to the discernment of a religious vocation or a vocation to religious life or even to marriage. Don't tune out immediately, but in a number of ways it is unapologetically a chance to have a frank and open conversation about the diocesan priesthood. Let's get started.
All right. Actually, can we get to know a little bit more about you? Something that we don't possibly know that's not available at any sort of biography on the internet about Father Nicholas Pearce.
You said you had some curveballs, and you're not supposed to start with the curveball. The curveball's supposed to come a bit later on in the podcast. Something that people don't generally know about me.
I've got something.
Okay, careful now.
You're a CrossFit fanatic.
You can tell by my remarkable physique.
No. So the 2 weeks I've been here, we've been waking up quite early to do WODs. So WODs is WOD, which means workout of the day, and they're grueling, and to add on to the early mornings, it's early
just being 5:15. In the garage?
In the garage.
Pretty cold?
It's amazing how you've sustained this for how long?
You're surprised?
Yes. I'm very surprised. Okay.
Again, might not be quite completely clear to people who are listening rather than watching the podcast. I'm not the fittest beast in the stable.
But you've got determination.
I do have sheer grit and determination, which might come up as we continue to discuss discernment, and sometimes I think sheer grit and determination is what we need. But no, I've been in various formats over the last couple of years. Been visiting Box Hill CrossFit down the road from here.
Good.
There's something I find really analogous to the church and to the priesthood with it, and that is that I can walk in there as a sort of early to middle-aged man who's not particularly fit, and work out with a whole variety of people. And you've got pregnant women, and you've got really fit sort of people, and then you've got people who are less fit than me. Not many, but people from a whole variety of scales and fitnesses can work out together. And I think there's something a little bit churchy about that.
Yes, it's a community.
We all come from different areas, and everything's a little bit sort of variable, constantly varied, they tell me. So, okay, now we're going to get to the topic.
All right.
I'm going to drill you a little bit. So, we are talking about the diocesan priesthood, and there's lots of different ways in which we can find out information. And back in the day when I was discerning my vocation, the internet was just being introduced, so websites were just coming around. But I suppose one of the most pivotal examples for me of priesthood was my own parish priest growing up. And he was a very fine priest and a very good example of the priesthood. Who have you had in your life, JC, who has been an example to you of the priesthood?
Oh, it's funny you say parish priest. When I was growing up, my parish priest was Father Brendan Lane. Now,
wow.
He was formerly the rector of Corpus Christi College.
Yep.
And to enter into that environment and knowing a familiar face, which was Father Lane, was great. Like I found that knowing familiar face within the seminary made it a lot easier to transition. And he was one of the priests that have influenced the discerning for me.
Was there something in particular about him when you were a young man in particular that made him inspiring?
Oh yes, he's got a radio voice. Like that's one of his traits.
We should get him on the podcast.
Sounds like he's got some cotton in his mouth, but but he was very fatherly, and that's one of the traits that not myself but also a lot of seminarians agree upon, that he was very pastoral in his daily works. If he would see a broken light, he would fix it. He would grab a ladder, or a broken door. He'd fix that. and then move on his way to find something else to fix. I mean, I think that was a trait of his generation, of his ilk.
Yeah, we had him at the seminary, and one of the big things that he was always on about was cars and making sure people looked after their own car.
And know how to change a tyre.
And knew how to change a tyre.
That's
so
right.
I can see that in you. My parish priest growing up, one of the things, and I was very lucky, I got to invite him. You're about to be ordained a deacon, God willing, in a few months' time. But at my diaconate, my parish priest was the one who vested me in my dalmatic at the ceremony, which was a great honour for me to have a man who'd been such a great influence for me do that. But at the dinner, we had a little dinner that evening with my family and friends, and I spoke of the parish priest, and I said it was quite remarkable because he was the man who influenced me most, even though he never once spoke to me about priesthood. It was just through his example and his really strong priestly identity.
Yes.
He didn't have to ask me the question, but there was something about him, and there was something about his life that inspired me. And the only other example, so I had two examples really in my discernment. One was very close, my parish priest, and one was a lot further away, and that was, of course, Pope John Paul II, now St. John Paul II. And again, like my parish priest, he was a man who just had such a strong priestly identity.
Yes.
It radiated from every sort of part of his being. When he spoke, when he celebrated Mass, when he greeted people. If you know what I mean, there's some great photos out there of him sort of kissing babies that were handed to him, and you could just see this fatherly instinct. And I think that's one of those things sometimes people say, oh, I think I'd make a good father. And it's like, well, look at John Paul II. He was a great father.
One of the greats, yeah.
The Holy Father. So he was a great influence for me. And two things, if people are looking, and it really saddens me because so many people don't have that lived experience of John Paul II anymore, because it was, 16, maybe 17 years ago that he died. But read his writings, and in particular, his writings to young people. He wrote letters every Palm Sunday to the youth of the world, and you can just read them again and again and again, and there's a whole heap of richness in there. But also, in particular, if you're a young man and you're thinking about the priesthood, Holy Thursday, he would write to the priests of the world. And again, there's just a treasury of information.
Yes, he wrote the book Pastoralis Dava Vobis, in which we learn in the seminary, and it's the program and the training for priests during for seminarians during their discernment years in the seminary. Yeah. And it's always it's the number one resource currently that we use to form young men for the priesthood.
I think one of the things that was a standout for him, and this, I suppose most people or young people who do remember him now remember him in his final year, remember him in his suffering, remember him with advanced Parkinson.
Yes, he was very frail.
Yeah, but he offered up his frailty as a sacrifice for the church. And he was a man who had suffered under the Nazi regime. He had suffered under communist rule. He had suffered an assassination attempt. He'd suffered throughout his priesthood. And then at the very end, he offers up this suffering as a great witness. And again, a really fine example to us of the martyrdom that priests are called to. And Father Brannan speaks about this in To Save 1,000 Souls. And he uses that great quote from Tertullian, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church.
Yes, I'm very familiar with that term. Martyrdom is such an interesting topic because, if you're in Australia, it's very rare that we do get Christians dying for their faith. But as we know, we all of us are called to either white martyrdom and red martyrdom. And white martyrdom is actually quite foreign to many believers. Can you take us through what white martyrdom would entail?
Yeah, well, I suppose, again, this idea of red martyrdom, and we see in saints throughout history, even in our modern times, there's been people who have actually given their lives for their faith. But I suppose the church has always understood that as red martyrdom or the martyrdom of blood, but white martyrdom is that we're called to be martyrs each and every day. Yes. And we're called to give of ourselves and give up of ourselves. And for Good Shepherd Sunday, we saw that in the gospel, the idea of laying down our lives, and that in particular priests are called to lay down their lives for the sheep, for the flock.
Yeah, because that's what martyrdom means, is to unite perfectly with Christ, and to unite particularly in his suffering and death, which is he died for the glory of the Father and for the salvation of souls. Yeah.
And in my own discernment, so I'd felt the call to the priesthood quite early enough to attend a World St. John Paul II and that was where I first felt this inkling of a call. I then spent a couple of running away from it, trying to convince myself that I could find another way of serving and fulfilling this need that was within me without any of the sacrifice, without any of the hardships. And I courses and I volunteered and I did a to make the sacrifice and make the sacrifices, those obstacles in my mind of the priesthood. And I suppose the Lord, I needed that time to purify my own intentions and to prepare myself for what it meant to enter into a seminary and to take that next step. But I needed to come to terms with the fact that if I was going to follow the Lord's will in my life, that was going to include about that head. I think one of the bigger challenges for young people today is this idea of obedience. Priests promising obedience. In the week, priests on the day from the military, but the military again is only a small period of someone's life, and obviously then marriage. But when else and what other calling requires is actually much more countercultural than chastity or celibacy is in.
But God prefers obedience rather than sacrifice.
Was there any obstacles for you in your own discernment, sort of as a young man?
Oh yes, there were plenty.
Study time for the seminarians, and Jaycee has been a great example of procrastination.
Yes,
but he's getting through the work. He's getting through the work, and I'm not the best role model.
Discerning is basically you're beginning to start a relationship with the Lord, who calls you to discern a vocation to the priesthood or to the other vocations. And there's a recent term out there in social media, I'm not sure if you know or if you've done it yourself, it's called ghosting.
Ghosting, okay, tell me more.
So ghosting is when you receive a message but you don't answer it.
Yeah, I'm really bad at that. I didn't know it had a name. Now I'm in trouble because I know it's got a name.
Ghoster.
I am. I'm actually really bad. don't know what that's all about, but I'm only getting about 50%, says Father Zwans from Adelaide. Okay, well, we've got green lights all the way here, so we're just going to keep going and hope that the 50% you get is the good 50%, not the bad 50%. So, I think one of the other obstacles that a lot of people would present is this idea of it's too big a calling, and I'm not holy enough. I'm not holy enough to be a priest, which is something that I definitely have heard from young men who are discerning. But I think it's a sort of a common experience that even in our own lives we have to sort of overcome, because and again, Brannon in the book sort of points out it's a big calling, and he throws around these sort of three big Latin terms in his opening chapter: in persona Christi, capitas, alter Christus, and ex opere operato. So these three Latin terms that sort of get thrown around about the priesthood, but really actually go to the core of what it's all about. So that in this first instance, that if you're following a call to the priesthood, you've got to be ready to stand in the person of Christ, the head and shepherd.
Yes.
And this is a big sort of demand on anyone. So we all, through our baptism, stand in the person of Christ. We all, through our baptism, share in his priesthood. Men and women. We all share in the priesthood of Christ. So we all share in his role as teaching and passing on the faith to other people. We're all called to be witnesses to the gospel. We all share in his responsibility of sanctifying and praying and making the world a holier place. And we do this every time that we pray and every time we participate in the life of the church. We all do this.
Going back to your point of unworthiness, I think it's unworthiness or worthiness. It's dependent on your openness to change.
Yeah. And
how big your faith is. So you discerning for the vocation, you realise that you're a bit of a fixer-upper. We have a lot of those currently in the seminary. But it's precisely where you will be going and where you will go, which predominantly matters. Which is vastly a fixer-upper place.
Yeah.
And so your willingness to change and your willingness to allow yourself to be transformed is I think the remedy for that feeling of unworthiness.
And I think this is where we get to the point where there's a difference between the call of baptism and the call of ordination to the priesthood. So whilst we all share in the common priesthood of Christ, those who are called to the diocesan priesthood receive the grace of the sacrament of ordination. And therefore, it's actually not the man himself who does all of these things, but it is Christ who works through him. So no matter what your individual flaws may be, no matter what your individual struggles may be, it's God's grace that works in and through them to perfect you and to make you the priest that he needs you to be.
To elevate you.
Yeah. So I think this is a really important thing for young men who are considering a vocation to think of, okay, yes, does the seminary require a certain level of readiness, a certain level of maturity and a certain level of holiness? Yes. But do you have to be ready to, on the day that you walk into the seminary on day one, to do everything that a priest does and whatever? No, there's a reason why the seminary is a 7-year process. And that is because the seminary itself is there to help you as you grow into the vocation to which God is calling. And the seminary is also there is to help guys grow out. I mean, most seminaries have a retention rate of about 50%, which is a really good thing.
Actually, in my experience, the seminary is actually false. Like, our retention rate is quite high.
At the moment.
Yeah.
Well, no. And at any given time, seminaries go up and down, and it depends on how much discernment. And I think that's a good sign, because it means that there's a lot of discernment happening in the lives of young men before they come into the seminary. But there's also nothing wrong with a guy coming into the seminary after 1 or 2 years, discerning, with the help of the seminary process, with the help of his formators, with the help of his spiritual director, discerning that God isn't calling him to the priesthood. That means that the seminary is actually doing the job that it's been established to do.
With the calling and with discerning, it's like you drop everything and you leave, but as you leave, you take on new responsibilities. But also as you leave, because the majority of people who receive the calling are young adults, those late teens, early 20s sort of young men, and they're still trying to figure out what sort of man they want to become. And in the seminary, you have a lot of formation, you have a lot of human formation, you are spiritually formed, you're spiritually nourished, and you have an academic formation as well as partial formation, and you form these manly traits that you want to adopt. And what better to have the examples of priests, of saints, of the Catholic tradition, to make you a holistic man, a man ready for the world.
Yep. There's a great biography of the Venerable Fulton Sheen called Treasures in Clay, and I read it on my way into the seminary, and I generally recommend it to young men who are discerning. And just the title in and of itself speaks beautifully of the fact that we're earthenware vessels, we're clay vessels, and quite often we're cracked and we're a little bit broken, but it's through those cracks that the light of God can shine.
Yes.
And again, we've got to remember that if God's calling us to be priests, if God's calling you to be a priest, He is going to give you the grace necessary to fulfill that. And again, as a priest, I feel that all the time, in the sense, and I think one of the most, of all the occasions I feel it most, it's at the anointing of the sick, or the accompanying of praying with someone who is dying.
Yes.
Because when you get called to a hospital room at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, and you step into the life of a family you've never met before and may never meet again, it's not Nicholas Pearce the man who walks in. It's Jesus Christ the priest working through Nicholas Pearce the man that walks in. And so many times in those environments, and in one of my parish appointments we had a palliative care hospital, and quite regularly we'd get called to pray with the dying in the middle of the night, and you would be the only person in the room. And you would walk in feeling so inferior as to who am I? I don't know this person. Who am I to be here right now? But as you walk out, remembering, no, it was Christ who walked into this room. It was Christ who prayed. And this is that Latin phrase, in persona Christi. We work as alter Christus, as other Christs in the world. And that can only be achieved by grace.
Yes.
So Bishop Elliot, who's now the retired auxiliary bishop of Melbourne, famously commented a few years ago that sometimes we can be false. There's this false humility in young men who are discerning. Oh, I'm not holy enough. Well, you're never going to be holy enough to be a priest. Yes, you're going to grow in holiness, and yes, this is something that we're going to strive for time and time again, but you're never going to be holy enough to hold this great grace that God is offering to us. And we do the best we can and we keep striving, but it's God's grace that shines in and through us. And he says, all you have to do is look at the apostles to see that. No more is it true than in the first priests, the ones that Jesus himself chose. And he makes a reference to Hit Parade, which I had to go and look up. And it was a TV show in the 1960s and 70s, I think, like
Hit Parade,
like X Factor or
a talent show.
Now. Yeah.
Like the Mickey Mouse Club.
I don't know about that. But he says that the apostles weren't some hit parade of the time of Jesus. He said you've got scoundrels and liars and thieves and chiefs and cheats.
Tax
collectors and deniers and all of these people. But these are the ones that Jesus chose, and these are the ones that he ordained.
Yes, and qualified.
Yeah. So there's even hope for...
Oh, yes, definitely.
What did your family say when you told them that you were going into the seminary?
Right. I first told my mother. because I spoke to her over the phone. It wasn't in person. I was in Brisbane at the time when I told my parents, and I was there for holiday reasons, and I decided then and there that I'll make this decision. And I went to the Eucharist and Lord, like, tell your mum, tell your parents, tell the people you love. So I told my mum, and she's like, and we'll decide for you. So I came back home. I saw my dad. He was very, very quiet, but I knew in his heart that he was so supportive of this idea, of this path that had been revealed to me. So I got his blessing straight away. I knew it. I looked at him, and I imagined him always praying on Sunday for a priestly vocation. And I looked at him, and I knew. I told him in my mind, I was like, you've been praying for this. You've been praying every Sunday for priestly vocations. And now one of your sons has a vocation. And we didn't have to say anything. He was very proud from the very beginning. My mum took some convincing, but once I put on a sitan and sang the Salve Regina, she bawled her eyes out. She bawled her eyes out. It was that easy? Yeah, it was that easy. And she's been my number one supporter ever since.
Okay. It's not that easy for every family.
No. I've met a lot of people who who had parents even disown their sons.
Guys who have families who aren't particularly in agreement with the decision that they're making, and that's something that is really challenging for them, and they have to work through. But there's also something that I think is really important, and that's that our families always see us with our history. And if we're looking for advice on our discernment, we should take equally people who see us for our possibilities into the future. So for your mother and your father and your sisters and your aunties and your uncles, you're always going to be that snotty-nosed kid who ran around the back of the church, or never sat quietly, or used to not study well as a student, and now they're looking at you doing something sort of very different. So they're never going to be able to not see you with the eyes of the 15, 20, 25 years beforehand. And that's why one of the important steps in the process of discernment is that a young man has to give references. But one of the questions we generally ask is, what have people from your parish said? What have your school teachers said? What have people who can see you now as you are and into the future, do they think you'd make a good priest? Do they see priestly qualities in you? So again, looking for those people who see you for your possibilities, not just for your misspent youth, is an important step in the discernment.
It's very biblical that one leaves his family to pursue his own journey, or to pursue their own journey. And we see that in Abraham, and we see that also in the apostles, and also with Jesus. He leaves Mary to go forth and do his ministry. But particularly, it's when a man decides to leave the protection of the home, protection of the family, and to go out, and not to go out aimlessly, but to go out and follow the Lord, to follow the guidance that's been given to you from above. That's the adventure, and that's when your relationship becomes much more stronger. You have shared experience now with the Lord.
Yep. Great. Well, we've got plenty of time ahead to continue this discussion. So we're noticing that there's been a little problem with the sound throughout the evening. So if you didn't hear everything, we apologise for that. We'll try and sort that out. But make sure you maybe check the podcast during the week to see whether the recording, we were recording as well. So that may have been a better quality than the live stream, because the internet at this time of night is generally pretty heavily bogged down. But thanks for joining us. There's plenty ahead. So next week, we're going to look at the question of happiness and holiness. What does it mean for the church to be holy, and what happens when the church isn't holy? and how do we discern how God is calling us to be holy. So if you've got a copy of To Save 1,000 Souls, maybe read ahead through the next little section. But otherwise, we hope that you can join us. Hopefully you've found this helpful. It's been great having a good chat with you, Jaycee.
We appreciate your feedback as well. So if you have any feedback,
positive, constructive, good feedback.
This is the pilot, by the way.
This is the pilot. It can only get better from here.
Exactly.
But make sure you subscribe to Melbourne Praise and like the page, and also share this with your friends. Again, a frank and open discussion. But every young man should spend some time actively discerning his vocation. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.